Sorry if there's a bit of a bump. My recorder died in the middle of that. Crisis reveals character. And in World War II, Crisis revealed the character of quite a few people. And some of them for the better and some of them for the worse. The war transformed people in the city. There were people who went off to war and came back stronger. They went off and they found something in themselves they didn't know was there before. And they came back as better people. There were other people who went off to war and were so traumatized by the things that happened that they came back broken. They came back with troubles, and our society did not help them deal with those troubles very well. There were people who died whose lives were clearly transformed, and those deaths transformed the people around them. Some of them for the better, some of them for the worse. The city itself grew economically and was transformed, grew physically and was transformed, grew in population and was transformed. So the war did a lot in the city of Toledo. So let's talk about what this city was like before the war. So your main groups in Toledo, your main heritage groups, were our African American community, the German community, Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian. Those were kind of the bigger groups in Toledo before the war. Of course, there were many more. You had Greeks, you had the Syrians in Little Syria, the Syrians and Lebanese in Little Syria. You had the Irish that were down in Derby. But the kind of the major ones were the African Americans, Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Bulgarians. The Great Depression exacerbated racism. As we've talked about in class before, the Great Depression made racism worse. First people laid off from the factories were always the black workers. First people to lose their homes were almost always black people who missed a payment or two. And so the Depression made racism worse in the city. The Depression also exacerbated political differences in the city. So before the city, we had a Democratic Party and a Republican Party that basically got along. There wasn't a ton of animosity. During the Depression, there was. There was a ton of animosity between those in power and those out of power. And as we talked about, we elected our first socialist mayor during that time, Solon Klotz, who remains the only socialist mayor in Toledo history. You had violence on the streets during the Great Depression. You had nationalists by the end of the 30s. You had socialists in the middle of the 30s. You had the electric auto light strike. There was violence on the streets, as I've talked about before. There were bombings at job sites by unionists. Sorry. There were bombings at job sites by unionists. There were bombings of school board meetings and the president of the school board's house and a school. Bombing campaign that lasted through the 30s by unionists and socialists and nationalists. I have often said to people, and the incredible thing is you interview people who were children during the Great Depression in Toledo, and most of them are like, yeah, it was terrible, but my parents kind of shielded me from it. And then they'll tell me some story that makes me go, oh my gosh. And my feeling is, as a person from Generation X to you all who are Gen Z folks, Toledo between 1929 and 1940 is absolutely not a place you would have wanted to live. Toledo was a war zone many times. Toledo was unpleasant. Toledo was broke. It was not a great place. And as much as we romanticize the past, I promise you I would rather live in Toledo in 2021 than in 1931. So let's talk about the places we failed during this time. Ethnic whites, okay? During the Great Depression, Crisis revealed character with the ethnic white communities in Toledo, with the Poles, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Germans, the ethnic white groups who came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many of them participated in activities that were clearly racist during this time. When black families would try to move into a block, they would be told they couldn't settle there. By the time we get into the 1940s, there are vacant parts of town that have no houses that they try to build black housing, and the white people nearby go crazy about it. Ethnic whites, by and large, failed during this time to live up to the standards of the American dream. The Young Nationalists were a group in Toledo of far right-wing Tories who believed that Franklin Roosevelt was a secret communist who was out to turn America into the second Soviet Union. They carried out one of those bombing campaigns in the late 30s. That's an absolute failure. America Firsters. Some people who were in the America First movement in the 40s, some of them were decent people who were opposed to war no matter what. Others in the group were not quite like that. And there are lots of newspaper articles from the time of the America First folks who are just saying the quiet part out loud. Well, why are we going to go to war to save Jews? That doesn't make any sense to me. They're the ones starting all this in the first place. That's not acceptable. That's not okay. That's not who we are as Americans, or it shouldn't be who we are as Americans. And those are failures that we had in this city. This was not everybody coming together. There were large groups of people who didn't want to come together. When you see this picture of Robinson Junior High, that's the old Robinson that was over there behind St. Martin's Church. And that place, the auditorium, was literally bombed by a group of young nationalists who, again, thought Franklin Roosevelt was Joseph Stalin Jr. So let's talk about some of the heroes of Toledo during the war. People in Toledo who did things that mattered. Okay, and we'll kind of come back to the notion of hero in a little bit. Top picture is John David Biggers. Bottom picture is a guy named Barney Roos. His real first name was Delmar, but everybody called him Barney. Biggers was the president of Libby Owens Ford, as we've talked about before in here. And Franklin Roosevelt makes him the director of production for the War Production Board. Biggers does a couple of things for Toledo that helped Toledo really succeed during the Second World War. He had Toledo businesses inventory their factories. How much space do you have on the floor? How many electrical outlets? What kind of water do you have running into your factory? What kind of workers did you have? Okay, before the Depression, how many pipe cutters? How many pipe fitters? How many electricians? How many carpenters? How many tool and die guys? Who was trained for what? Give me a list of everything. Tools. What kind of tools do you have? Do you have pipe bending tools? Do you have welding equipment? Do you have like giant routers? What do you have in your factory? Using that, it wasn't hard to figure out, okay, Toledo has, 70 million square feet of factory floors. We have 720 tool and die makers. We have 500 skilled glass blowers. We have and on and on and on down the list. All of a sudden, you can take those numbers and you can match them up to what America needs to make for the war. And you can say, okay, this city has these things in this place. We can make 155 millimeter artillery shells in this factory that used to be the Jeep finishing plant. Biggers helps steer the contract for a vehicle initially called the Quad to Willis Overland. And Willis Overland, as you see in the bottom with Barney Roos, Willis Overland then gives birth to the Jeep. And the Jeep transforms Toledo, as you'll read about in an article by a friend of mine, the journalist and historian Vince Guerrieri. The Jeep becomes a symbol of this town, whether we like it or not. The Jeep is Toledo, and Toledo is the Jeep. Barney Roos, what did he do to this? So Roos developed an engine called the Go Devil, or modified an engine called the Go Devil. He was one of the chief engineers at Willis Overland. The Go Devil engine was a 4-cylinder engine. If you guys know anything about cars, that's a small engine. It's lightweight, but his engine was low horsepower. Like, I want to say 50, 60 horsepower engine, but it had really high torque. And torque is twisting force, right? On a 4-wheel drive vehicle, torque is a really big deal. You need high torque to be able to use the 4-wheel drive to get this thing out of the mud and up a hill and so on and so forth. Barney Roos putting that Go Devil engine into the Quad really makes this vehicle something special. Two other people who were critical to Toledo's war effort, Edmund Leslie Bowser and Philip Nash, the leader of Toledo Public Schools, the leader of the University of Toledo. These guys geared up UT and TPS not to teach kids, but to teach Toledoans. They took the entire city's education as their job, not just the students in their building. Both of them were radically inclusive men. Bowser was about as anti-racist a person as you could find in the 40s. Does that mean he was perfect? Absolutely not. But he very much tried to make sure that not just black students, but black adults were able to get into the programs that the city schools were putting together to train people for the war effort. Philip Nash. One of my favorite stories from the war, and I'm not going to go deep into it right now. You can buy Joanna's book when it comes out to learn more. One of my favorite stories is about a guy named Carl Joseph, who was an Arab American from the North End. Went to Woodward, got kicked out of Woodward, went to Waite, barely graduated from Waite, became a union organizer and was seen as a troublemaker and a socialist. And the dean at the University of Toledo was a guy by the name of Ray Carter. Carter, from the correspondence I've seen, was kind of a hothead. And he wasn't going to let no socialist come into his university. And Carl Joseph and his many friends wrote letters back and forth with President Nash. And President Nash let Carl Joseph into the university because he saw a young man who could be saved. And he wanted to save just this one kid, which I think is a sentiment a lot of teachers can understand. Nash befriends Carl Joseph for the rest of his life. And Carl Joseph goes off and fights in the war. He's a paratrooper. He and Nash keep up a correspondence through the whole war. And eventually Carl Joseph is killed in combat on D-Day. And Philip Nash loses a friend. But Nash was a guy who changed people's lives for the better. I will argue forever, Toledo doesn't do what it does in World War II without these two men. We don't have the trained workforce without E.L. Bowser. We don't have the trained workforce supervisors without Philip Nash, who turned UT into a training center for the war effort. And these two guys made it possible for our factories to have the workforce they did to get the war contracts that made the city successful in the post-war period. Two other people that you might not think of as being important in a war effort. The top person is Bishop Carl Alter, who was the leader of all the Catholic churches in the Toledo area during World War II. The bottom is Third Baptist Church, which is back behind Jones Leadership Academy today. And the pastor there was Reverend Calvin Steiner. Both of these men were prominent voices against racism in Toledo in a very racist era. We saw groups of Tories. If we go back to H.G. Wells and his vision, there were Tories who wanted to defend white neighborhoods. So, as I said, there were housing projects planned that would have been housing for African Americans in town, and people nearby fought against them viciously. We saw this happen with some Polish folks in Kuszwans who didn't want black people moving into their neighborhood. We saw it happen on the North End with Polish people in Lagrenka. We saw it happen out in Birmingham with Hungarian folks. Really, we saw this in almost every part of town. Where people said, not in my neighborhood. I don't want black people in my neighborhood. These were Tories, right? They're defending the old way of life. They're defending tradition. And they believe somebody should just stop this thing. And Carl Alter, if you look at the religious makeup of Polish folks and Hungarian folks and Bulgarian folks and German folks, a lot of them go to Catholic churches. Carl Alter was the leader of that church, and he spoke out loudly against white racism. He held special services and special meetings to talk about, we need to get past this. It's not fair. The conditions black people live in are substandard. We need to do something about that. And Carl Alter was a pretty powerful voice in our area against racism. And frankly, I don't think there's been a single Catholic leader since Carl Alter who's ever raised exactly the kind of principled stand against racism that Carl Alter did. And I say that as a person who's been a Toledo area Catholic for most of my life. Tories also wanted to ban Japanese residents. In 1943, the United States was starting to move some people out of the relocation camps in the West. And they were trying to help Japanese Americans find homes in cities in the industrial Midwest and the East Coast. And Toledo was one of these cities. And there were several dozen Japanese families who were supposed to move here, and we were going to help them get jobs and help them settle in and become part of our community. And the American Legion, which again is an organization that I really love, but in this case they were wrong. The American Legion put up a huge fight, and the Legion said, we are not going to let Japanese, but they didn't say Japanese, we're not going to let them live in this town. This is a white person's town. They can't be here. And Reverend Calvin Steiner from Third Baptist fought back hard against that racism. So also did Roy C. Start, who was at that point the former mayor of the city of Toledo. And Start and Steiner spoke out loud against the anti-Japanese racism. This is from a 1943 Blade story talking about Calvin Steiner, Reverend Calvin Steiner from Third Baptist over there in Hamilton, about Japanese residents coming into Toledo. So, quote, as the Blade said, quote, even though Negroes would suffer most in competition for jobs, living quarters, and standard of living with relocation to Japanese here, he was in favor of the plan, Steiner told the city council. Quote, we know very well the problems of minority people and believe that the American-born Japanese should be accorded the same treatment as other Americans of enemy nationality. Now, let's just unpack what Calvin Steiner said there, because it's amazing. What Steiner is saying is that we've got a lot of German Americans in this town. We've got a handful of Italian Americans in this town. We're not telling them they can't live here. We're not telling them to get out. And if you look at the membership of the American Legion at that point, there were a lot of German last names. Calvin Steiner really fired a shot across the bow on these guys, saying we know very well the problems of minority people and believe American-born Japanese should be accorded the same treatment as other Americans of enemy nationality. Steiner was darn hero, all right? He stood up for the right thing. He and Carl Alter, two great Toledoans. Now, the Toledoans who went to war, why'd they fight? Lots of reasons. Just like anything else. There's no single reason people go to war. Some people wanted adventure, for sure. There were some people who just wanted to go live an adventure. And they were around. Some people wanted to fight for their ancestral lands. So, in Toledo, huge Polish population, there were a lot of Polish young men who joined the army in 39, 40, and 41 before America went to war because they thought, we're going to get in this fight and we're going to go defend Poland. We're going to defend our homeland. Same thing with Bulgarian kids in town and Romanian kids in town. They joined because they wanted that fight to defend their homeland. Most importantly, Toledo has always had a large Jewish population. Russian Jews, Czech Jews, German Jews that have lived in Toledo. Toledo's Jewish population very much, and Polish Jews, by the way, very much were interested. Young Jewish men signed up at a rate I don't think you saw in other groups, very much wanting to defend the Jewish people. Some people want to fight for America, and you saw this a lot out of people, again, from every nationality, from every race. Black kids, white, and both boys and girls wanted to fight for America. Some of them wanted to do that. Some people joined to control their destiny a little bit. So, Bill Thomas, who you've learned about, we're going to come back to him. Dr. Thomas joins the Navy, not because he was go-go America, not because he was like, I love the sea and I want to go in the Navy. He joined the Navy because he realized, okay, with my education at this point in the war, I don't want to die. And my best chance to not die is join the Navy, where they will probably make me a yeoman, which is a person who basically does paperwork at this point. I'll probably get one of those jobs, and I've got less of a chance of having to go off with a rifle and die on some muddy slope somewhere. He absolutely made that decision. I'll tell you something real quick. One of my great uncles, whom I share the name with, my great uncle Joe. My great uncle Joe saw his brothers get drafted into the Army, and he's like, I do not want any part of that Army business. So he joined the Coast Guard because he believed, if I join the Coast Guard, they're just going to keep me in Cleveland. I'm going to be fine. Well, of course, that's not what the Coast Guard does in wartime, and he did get shipped out, and he ended up fighting in both Europe and the Pacific, one of the very few people who did so, and he was terribly injured in the war. But he thought he could control his destiny, and he tried to. Finally, lots of people did not want to go at all. Lots of people who fought did not want to fight. Okay? They were drafted. They didn't want to go. Some of them had kids. Some of them had wives. They did not want to go to war. This was not their choice. So then once they got there, why did they fight? Well, to understand that, I would really encourage you to read the book. Excuse me. To read the book by Christopher Hamner. Dr. Hamner is a professor at George Mason University, and his book is about why soldiers fight. What is combat motivation? And it's a really good book, and it goes deeply into these issues in the Revolution, in the Civil War, and the Second World War. Finally, let's talk about heroism. Heroism is a word that we throw around way too much. Okay, somebody hits a great jump shot in the last couple seconds of a game, we say he's a hero. Somebody hits a big home run, we say they're a hero. Somebody records a great song and people call them a hero. That is not heroism. Heroism, let's get one thing out of the way first. Heroism is not killing. Killing guys in the war does not necessarily make you a hero. All right? And there are multiple examples throughout the Second World War of American soldiers who murdered people, murdered prisoners, murdered civilians. That's not heroism. Okay? There's examples of guys in combat who fired one shot and happened to kill a guy. And that's not necessarily heroism either. Heroism sometimes does involve killing someone. All right? But one of my favorite definitions I've ever heard of heroism and bravery is doing what you need to do even when you're scared. Okay? That heroes are not superhuman. They're people who got scared. They did what they had to do. Many heroes deal with the results of that for the rest of their life, where they did that thing, they killed people, they didn't want to, they had to, they did it anyways, and afterwards had to deal with the pressure from that. One of the things I think gets overlooked too much is that sometimes heroism is just endurance. Okay? Sometimes heroism isn't one great moment. Like, one of Toledo's great heroes is Robert Craig, after whom the drawbridge downtown is named after. He had one big day where he took out a couple of German machine gun posts. He was killed in action. He had one big day. There are other people in the story of Toledo who just endured terrible thing after terrible thing after terrible thing, and they came home, and they did what they needed to do even though they were scared. Even though it was unpleasant, they did what they needed to do. And to me, that's heroism too. So let's talk about some of my personal heroes from Toledo in the Second World War. Jacob Chandler. I've talked about him. Dr. Green talked about him when we talked about the TPD. You see him there in his TPD uniform. So Jake Chandler, as we discussed with Dr. Green, is the only Toledo police officer ever killed in action for his country in the military. Obviously, other police officers have died in the line of duty. Chandler left the police department to join the Army in the war. He was an enlisted guy. He was selected to become an officer. He led his men bravely in the Winter of 45 in the 92nd Division. I believe 370th Regiment, if I'm remembering correctly. Chandler's men at this Battle of Cinqual Canal were one of the only units to hold their ground. It was winter, it was muddy, it was nasty, and it was a losing proposition. Jake Chandler did what he had to do anyways, and he was killed in action. And Jake Chandler, in every facet of his life, is a hero in my book. Stephen Mossbacher, Moose. Those of you who were with me first semester know how much I think of this man. Stephen Mossbacher here was born in Nuremberg, Germany, and his family emigrated to the United States in 1938, just a few weeks before Kristallnacht, when the Nazis looted every Jewish home in the area. His parents got out of Germany, in the grand scheme of things, seconds before it was impossible to get out of Germany. And they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, they made it to New York, they stopped there for a little while, and then they came to Toledo. And Stephen's dad was a doctor here in Toledo. And Stephen ends up joining the Army in 43 to go back and liberate his homeland. Now, here's what's so important, guys. What was Stephen Mossbacher's home country? What country did he need to set free? Germany. One of the things that we so often get wrong, we say, well, it was the Germans against the Jews. Wrong. It was German Christians against German Jews. Germany was every bit as much Stephen Mossbacher's country as it was Hitler. I would argue it was more his country than it was Hitler's. Okay? Mossbacher went back to set his people free, the German people. And I think often about the courage it took to be Stephen Mossbacher. He's in a very elite unit of counterintelligence guys that interrogate enemy soldiers because they speak the language and know the culture. They did other stuff too that was pretty crazy. And Mossbacher did what he had to do even when he was scared, and he lost his life in the process. Stephen Mossbacher is absolutely a Toledo hero. Lou Diamond, this guy, one of my favorites. If you took the World War II class, you know all about old Gunny Lou. If you don't, you need to take the World War II class next year. This man was 52 years old when World War II broke out and went and fought anyways. It was his second consecutive World War. Lou Diamond was a legend in the Marine Corps when he left for World War II, and he came back as something even more than a legend. He had tropical diseases, he had rot on his feet, and he had his men carry him around in a wheelbarrow to get to the next mortar to make sure it was aimed the right way to fight the Japanese. Endurance. 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 Lou Diamond had that more than most. Bill Thomas, who we just talked about a little bit ago. Thomas endured racism his entire life. From being born in Moultrie, Georgia, through racism he endured as a child, through racism he endured in TPS at Libby High School, through racism he endured at the University of Toledo, through racism he endured at Ohio State working on his master's, through racism he endured at Northwestern when he was working on his PhD, to the racism he endured when he got into the Navy, and racism that almost could have killed him in Point Place when right after the war, he went out to the bar with a couple of white soldiers with the same sailors with the same rank as him, and a fight almost started in a bar in Point Place on Summit Street. Thomas endured and endured and endured, and that is heroism to me. Margaret Chick. I love Margaret Chick. Margaret Chick was personal secretary to Dwight Eisenhower. She was one of the first women in Toledo to join the Women's Army Corps. She was either number 1 or number 2, depending on who you listen to. She went in and endured sexism that is almost unfathomable. And, in fact, endured sexism before the war. Endured it during the war. Endured combat conditions. She was caught in air raids as she was working at the headquarters. She knew the sound of gunfire when she heard it, and she was not armed. She endured and endured and endured. Joe E. Brown. I know I keep saying one of my favorites. Joe Brown was from Holgate, Ohio, moved to Toledo when he was a little kid, became an actor. Back before movies were even around, he was like a stage actor traveling around with vaudeville shows. And then when movies came about, he became a famous comic actor, a comedian. His son is a pilot in the Army Air Corps and gets killed in a training accident in 1942. Joe Brown endured the loss of a child, and he channeled his grief and his rage into entertaining other people's sons all around the world to make their war a little bit better. Joe Brown traveled more miles than any other American entertainer. When most people my age or older think about the Second World War and entertainers, they think of Bob Hope, who's a good guy, but Bob Hope didn't travel half the miles that Joe Brown did. Bob Hope didn't go to the front lines. Joe Brown did. He got closer and closer to the front lines. He got himself put on 5 separate bombing missions because he wanted to be at the front. He wanted to experience what his son would have before his son died. And Joe Brown endured traumas that I can only scarcely imagine. Finally, I believe this finally, is a man I was really lucky to call my friend for a brief period of time, Bill Pravancha. Mr. Pravancha, if you were in my first semester class, you remember a lot about him. He was originally from Point Place, and he went to Waite High School, played sports at Waite High School, graduated in the middle of the Depression, tried to keep things together, and then when it became clear he was going to get drafted, he tried to choose his own destiny, and he got into the Army Air Corps because he believed it was safer. And then when he got in the Army Air Corps, they offered a promotion and $50 extra a month if you became a gunner. So he signed up to be a gunner. And he flew over a dozen successful missions. He had 3 planes crash underneath him. His first flight across the ocean, when they went over to get to the battle zone, their plane crash landed in the English Channel, just off the coast of Scotland, and they had to swim and wade to shore. Then the next plane he was on got shot up so badly they barely landed it, and it had to be scrapped. And then the third plane he was on was the one that finally went down. And Mr. Pravancha's plane went down, but he was able to jump out and pull his parachute in time, landed safely in German territory, and was taken prisoner, and endured as a prisoner of war throughout the last year of the war. Finally, as the Germans were marching them out near the end of the war, he and a couple buddies escaped, and they managed to sneak their way to the American lines and to freedom, and he got out. I got to meet Mr. Pravancha in the last couple of years of his life. Had it not been for COVID, I think we would have talked many more times. But I got to talk to him in the summer of 2019 and spent a few really great hours interviewing him about his experiences in the war. And the thing that struck me was that through everything this man had endured in the war, he closed the door on that. And he lived his life. And he made his workplace, he worked for GM, he made his workplace a better place. He worshiped at a church in North Toledo. He made his church a better place. He made his neighbors better people. He made his children and grandchildren amazing people. And he just decided to endure in life and make the world a better place than he found it. And I was so sad that with COVID, I wasn't, that there wasn't a funeral or anything like that, because this is one of those guys who became one of my personal heroes over the past couple of years. So, folks, I hope this kind of takes you through Toledo and World War II a little bit. We're going to talk about how the war influenced the city at large. We're going to get away from these personalities and talk about how the war influenced the city at large in a separate video. For now, thanks for sticking with me, and as always, be well and endure.